Hello and welcome, comrades. Social Security, Bernie Sanders, fire departments, the Soviet Union, Medicare, Norway, the post office, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., the military, COVID-19 vaccines. What do all of these things have in common? They're all called socialists, sometimes as a way to demonize them, but sometimes as a retort to people who say everything they don't like is socialist. As in, oh, you demonize Medicare for all as socialist. Are you against Social Security? Because that's socialism too. You against that popular program? And it's easy to see why people often think this way when you realize the prevailing definition of socialism for a lot of people is when the government does stuff, or when the government does stuff the private sector could/should do, or general government tyranny of any kind. Definitions are human inventions, so you can't really say there is an intrinsically right or wrong definition for anything. It's better to think of definitions as either useful or not. And socialism as gummy mint isn't a useful definition. Trying to define anything can potentially be tricky. You could give a simple dictionary-style single-sentence definition, and hopefully that gets across what you mean by a given word, with only the need to cross-reference a few words that may not be understood. Some concepts require a lot more nuance and context to fully understand them. For a word like socialism, a simple dictionary-style definition could be found, for example, in a dictionary. All different dictionaries have more or less the same definition, some are better than others, but with few exceptions, they tend to conflate socialism with government control, and they lack the context necessary to better understand it. Whatever dictionary I have set for my word processor actually has one of the better definitions I've seen. A definition of socialism doesn't need to become a history lesson, but at the very least, a good definition of socialism should include the fact that it is a response to capitalism, which is why I have made my own definition this way. A political, social, and economic theory developed in opposition to capitalism that is based on democratic, popular ownership of the means of production and on workplaces being likewise democratically run by the workers themselves. This definition, however, doesn't include all the nuance of socialist thought. So, to put it another way, socialism is an idea in opposition to capitalism and capitalist features like private ownership of the means of production, the profit motive, commodity production, and owner control of the workplace, etc. And instead advocates for common ownership of the means of production, economic distribution based on the needs of the people, and worker control of the workplace with a strong emphasis on democratization of the economy and flattening hierarchy. In the last video, we looked at liberalism, and to reiterate from the last video, I'm using capital L liberalism. Socialism and liberalism aren't always looking at the same things, and they don't always answer the same political questions in opposing ways. Socialism is defined in opposition to capitalism, not necessarily liberalism, though it often is. It's really just a circumstance of history that liberalism hitched its wagon to capitalism. The Enlightenment values that led to liberalism also led to socialism. And socialists generally favor some liberal values like equal treatment under the law and due process. Liberalism was developed as a philosophy to expand freedom and rights to more people in more realms of society. Socialism seeks to add drudgery and the exploitation of work to the oppressive forces from which we should have freedom. Socialism is a theory about the way society functions. It's a paradigm shift for civilization. What function does a civilization serve? And can we shape that function for maximal benefit? Civilization largely is a surplus management system. For most of human history, and I mean the vast, vast majority of human history, there was no such thing as a surplus. Humans ate what they could get from that day's activities of hunting and foraging, with the occasional chance to get by for slightly longer. Humans didn't have wardrobes, and they didn't possess things they didn't make themselves and that didn't have an immediate purpose. Most waking hours were spent surviving. Groups of humans couldn't get too large when hunting and foraging was the mode of survival. But with the advent of agriculture brought the ability to sustain more people with less effort and access to more resources than are naturally available. So far, the surplus of societies throughout history have been managed by hierarchical structures. Currently, the mode of production in much of the world is capitalism, where resources and productive capital are privately owned by capitalists, and the surplus created in this economy belongs to them. Capitalism arose out of feudalism, and the class structure of feudalism is a little too complex to get into now, but the social surplus created in feudalism belonged to monarchs and vassal lords. In these and other hierarchical structures of social economy, the class that owns and controls the social surplus is not the class that actually does the work to produce the social surplus. In capitalism, the workers and their labor makes the social surplus, and peasants created the social surplus in feudalism. There's a reason I use social surplus. An individual case where a good or service is sold for more than the cost to produce it is merely a surplus for the individuals involved in the production of that commodity. But the surplus created by one class and extracted by another class at large isn't the result of any one tool, machine, invention, or production method. When some brilliant entrepreneur develops a groundbreaking technology, it's very unlikely, and in fact impossible, this achievement was entirely their own, instead being the result of countless contributions from society. The entrepreneur likely has workers who are really doing the work of innovation, and any actual contribution from the capitalists didn't pop out of the vacuum of space. Advances are almost always built off of previous discoveries and innovations. We can get even more granular in all the ways society built the advances attributed to entrepreneurs. The education they attained is a product of society. The infrastructure they use to distribute their goods is created by society. They often benefit from bank investments backed by the government, etc. The Ayn Rand ideal of the industrialist who is solely responsible for their success just doesn't exist. Individual success is built on the shoulders of everyone throughout history who has brought society to where it is now. And all that has brought us to the present shouldn't belong to any one person or class to profit from. The entirety of humanity are the inheritors of a great legacy, but only a few get to fully benefit from it. You've likely heard the meme, socialism is when no iPhone. Capitalism didn't create the iPhone. People using tools made by other people using inventions and production methods created by yet other people using the principles of science developed over the course of generations created the iPhone. Thinking about how society is a surplus management system and our surpluses being the result of a societal contribution, it stands to reason that society should collectively enjoy the surpluses it creates. But unfortunately, the hierarchies that exist in our society are self-perpetuating. Their power is justified by the very fact that they have power. And when capitalists become successful in a society that is supposedly meritocratic, the logic of class divides is circular, where by virtue of merit preceding success necessarily, if someone is successful, then they must have earned it. And the proof that they earn success is the fact that they are successful in the first place. Having said all this, there's often a lot of confusion about why socialists oppose capitalism. It's not because capitalism is the worst thing that's ever happened to humanity. In fact, if you've ever read Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the most historically significant socialist thinkers, you'll find that, in the scope of human history up to the time they lived, capitalism is the most humane and progressive way of organizing the social economy yet. Hard to believe, right? Capitalism is hierarchical and exploitative, to be sure, but a lot less so than feudalism, for example. Marx and Engels, after all, were far less removed from feudalism than we are today. You don't have to be a liberal to admit that capitalism has made things a lot better for a lot more people than in previous historical epochs. And the socialist critique of capitalism doesn't come from class resentment, as is often accused of being. You just want socialism because you're jealous of other success. The argument behind socialism is that society has been moved forward by collective action in such a way that the hierarchies that determine the distribution of resources are no longer needed. Technological and societal advancement is possible when there are people who don't have to toil nonstop for mere subsistence, and a society can afford to lose a few working bodies to philosophizing and inventing when there is a surplus for those people to live off of. The reason much of science came from the clergy for so many centuries is, well, the clergy didn't work and thus had the time to spend on such endeavors. Even in the days of Marx and Engels, basically 2 centuries ago, society had advanced to the point where it was possible to distribute the productive burden evenly, with advances in production allowing for work to be easier and less intensive in many industries. And that's possible now more than ever. Let the robots do the work, and we can all become philosophers and play the sitar. And if we can't achieve that, we can at least make it so one's ability to sell their labor to a capitalist isn't a necessary prerequisite to survive and live a comfortable, meaningful life without undue burdens or hardships. While writing this video, I came across this quote from a blog post by the Communist Party USA. The problem isn't that capitalism is self-contradictory. It isn't even that capitalism is unfair. When we really dig down to the bottom of things, the contradictions of capitalism are holding us back. We live in the richest, most productive, most interconnected society that has ever existed on Earth, and yet some of us are overworked, others are underemployed, and millions live in poverty. But as I said earlier, hierarchies are self-perpetuating. Socialists throughout history have thought there would be a time when the contradictions of capitalism would collapse it, and there should be a sufficiently class-conscious proletariat that would seize the means of production. It may be hard to realize considering how politics is usually thought of, but socialism is a political tradition that includes anarchism and communism, and the different schools of socialism differ in many ways, but they don't differ in that assessment. It's what happens after the seizure of the means of production where there's a difference. It should go without saying that capitalism didn't collapse in much of the world, to put it mildly. But there have been many proletarian movements that have successfully done revolutions that have ushered in what have been called socialist states. The Bolshevik Revolution led to a so-called socialist republic in Russia and other parts of the Caucasus that expanded further to become the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Red Army came out of the Chinese Civil War to establish the People's Republic of China. The 26th of July movement, among other groups, toppled the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista to form the present government of the Republic of Cuba. The Civil War in Vietnam, which the United States interjected itself into, leading to the Vietnam War and expanding out to Laos and Cambodia, led to the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, Lao People's Democratic Republic, and Democratic Kampuchea. These are just a few examples, and please note that I'm referring to these countries as socialist and using terms like Democratic Republic because that's how they have called themselves and that's how they are officially categorized. For a century now, socialists have debated if this or that country is actually socialist, and if they are socialist, whether they should be looked to as good examples of socialism. Now, the scope of this video doesn't allow for a thorough examination of that debate. But let me say, by way of short summary of how I come down on the subject, I don't hold up the Soviet Union as an example of socialism, and though there's some positives you can point to, the negatives, in my opinion, come out far ahead. And while I think the USSR was technically socialist in the very strictest sense, except the democracy part, of course, I don't think that it was socialist in a meaningful way that would make it a worthy blueprint for a socialist society. Other countries like the People's Republic of China, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and Democratic Kampuchea should be completely disowned by leftists as not just authoritarian and not worthy examples of socialism, but of not being socialist at all, with China in particular being highly capitalistic. Also, let me say that in what I've seen, Cuba is the most sympathetic and least problematic of any of the socialist countries I've looked at. Unfortunately, a lot of what you come across concerning Cuba is pretty unreliable, and often I'll hear another new thing about Cuba that makes it look bad that turns out to be complete bullshit upon later exploration. Cuba is not perfect or even ideal, but a lot of the bad things you hear about Cuba are hardly more than propaganda. Most examples of so-called socialist states have their own unique failings, and some of them have successes, and they mostly share some characteristics that make them not socialist in a meaningful sense. They have governments that are authoritarian in at least some degree. They practice political repression to various degrees, and they, again, to varying degrees, contain in their economies attributes of capitalism that don't amount to common ownership of the means of production with worker control of the workplace. When we talk about so called socialist states and whether they are in fact socialist, we need to step outside the letter of the definition of socialism and consider what else common ownership and worker control implies. For example, being a response to capitalism, socialism should be about overturning capitalist characteristics of the economy, like commodity production, for example, and places like China have not abolished the commodity form. And while common ownership or collective ownership doesn't preclude government as the mechanism for achieving that, after all, if the government represents the populace and if the government is democratic, why can't the government be the body that owns the means of production on behalf of the collective organ? I do think it goes against the spirit of socialism to put the collective will in the hands of an inescapably hierarchical entity. On the other hand, the word government can mean almost anything, even a decentralized syndicalist system of unions and worker councils. What we should be talking about is the state, which is often referred to interchangeably with the word government, but the distinction is important. On the topic of authoritarian government and political repression, one could argue that it's needed defensively because any socialist country is going to have forces both internal and external trying to undermine it. That's not an argument completely without merit, and repression is almost unavoidable. Unless capitalists and the government that work for the capitalists the world over decide to voluntarily give up control of their capital to the proletariat, the bourgeoisie are going to have to face repression. I mean, after all, we are talking about taking their property away from them. I'd love a passive bourgeoisie and a peaceful and completely non-forceful transfer to socialism, but I kind of think that authoritarianism was the feature and not the bug for someone like Stalin, for example. Just try to imagine what would happen if hostile opposition was magically no longer a factor for these countries. I really doubt that China is just waiting for security and stability to stop being repressive. Socialism should be democratic, though some proponents of socialism throughout history haven't seen democracy as a priority. We need to consider how we can make democracy more democratic in the context of socialism. Government isn't the only way to practice democracy, and governance isn't solely expressed by the state. Repression is the domain of the state. And the state being the tool one class uses to repress another, we should seek to limit the state in hopes of eventually eliminating it entirely along with every other form of unjustified hierarchical institutions. I guess you could come up with a school of socialist thought that isn't against hierarchy necessarily, but I don't think that would be very useful in advocating for the working class, which suffers largely as the result of hierarchy. Examples of socialist states throughout history, like the USSR and the PRC, are the primary ways people are exposed to the concept of socialism. And the centralized authoritarian nature of their economies is a big reason why the popular definition of socialism is when the government does stuff. The dictatorship of the proletariat is an idea that there would be a period after a proletarian revolution where a state would exist to manage the complexities of an economy transitioning away from capitalism and to put down reactionary counter-revolutionary activity. Now, dictatorship doesn't sound too democratic, I'll admit, but what we are talking about is the rule of the proletariat as an entire class, not the rule of a single person or small group of party elites. If the majority of the people are proletarian, and a vast majority at that, and there's a government that is represented by the majority of the population, what do you call that? Oh yeah, democracy. The dictatorship of the proletariat is almost certainly necessary. The economy as it stands is much too complicated to completely reorganize it from scratch without an intermediary step. And even the most zealous anti-authoritarian understands that you can't just expect a government to let people try to overthrow and undermine it with no response. Democracy doesn't preclude all forms of repression. The socialist revolution, however, shouldn't end with the dictatorship of the proletariat. You can say that my opposition to actually existing socialism is a cop-out. Yeah, you say you're against capitalism and for socialism, but you just want to talk about it and not get your hands dirty and do the work of actually implementing socialism. The Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, and other places actually got it done. And you just want to cry foul without saying how you could do better. I don't think that's a completely unfair critique, except for the fact that China didn't get it done and only succeeded in making an even worse version of capitalism, and the Soviet Union betrayed the ideals of the revolution before eventually collapsing and leaving an insanely corrupt, kleptocratic oligarchy in its wake. I can't say exactly how an ideal form of socialism is going to operate. That's utopianism, and the material conditions will dictate how things are going to turn out, not our hopes, dreams, and pontification. And even though I would like to express some of the specific ways I'd like to see society shift, this video is getting a bit too long to include all that, so I think those kind of details would be best served in individual videos that cover different aspects of how socialist society could look. The idea of socialism as gummy mint extends to less authoritarian countries like Norway or other Scandinavian social democracies, or any other country with a strong welfare state. But instead of a one-party state running a centrally planned economy, the Scandinavian model is thought of as socialism by virtue of its strong welfare and other social safety nets. In the United States, we likewise see a tendency to think of welfare and safety net programs as being socialism, though the United States has paltry safety net programs compared to basically every other first world country. Again, we're seeing the idea of socialism as the government providing goods and services. But there's also an aspect of decommodifying sectors of the economy. For example, every rich country except the United States has a single-payer healthcare system, and some countries even have nationalized the hospital system. Most American leftists support a single-payer healthcare system, with Medicare for all being the policy that is now championed to achieve this goal. While completely removing an entire industry from the free market isn't exactly in line with capitalism, it's not completely antithetical either. Liberalism makes plenty of leeway for essential services to be provided by the government, and liberalism, you'll remember, is the philosophical basis for capitalism. But single-payer healthcare is really just a safety net and, like other safety nets, doesn't represent a wholesale and radical shift in the proletariat's relationship to the means of production, especially when it only represents a small part of the economy. Socialism equals the government is further represented, especially in the United States, in phrases like socialism for the rich and corporate socialism. Funnily enough, as I was writing this video, I came across a video on Jacobin's YouTube channel that uses this framing, and I got into a little comment section row with someone who didn't think that kind of framing was a big deal and not worthy arguing about. It ended fine, so I only mention that as a funny coincidence because I just so happened to be thinking about it already when this happened. My problem is there's already enough confusion among the general public that thinks socialism is government/state control, and further conflating the two isn't something an ostensibly socialist publication should be doing, especially when there are other terms like corporate welfare. Exactly how our tax cuts and subsidies worker control, especially when those tax schemes favor the capitalist class. Let's do a find and replace where we find socialism and replace it with collective ownership or worker control. Common ownership for the rich? No, that doesn't work. Worker control for the rich? No. I guess I'll leave things there. This video ended up being more about what socialism isn't than what it is, but like I said earlier, what socialism ends up looking like will depend largely on the material conditions. To reiterate, socialism is an idea in opposition to capitalism and capitalist features like private ownership of the means of production, the profit motive, commodity production, and owner control of the workplace, etc., and instead advocates for common ownership of the means of production, economic distribution based on the needs of the people, and worker control of the workplace with a strong emphasis on democratization of the economy and flattening hierarchy. Anyway, see you next time. Thank you in solidarity. Take care of yourself and each other. The economy as it stands is much too complicated. Most American leftists support a single-payer And if we can't achieve that, we can at least make it so one's ability to sell. And if we can't achieve that, we can at least make it so one's ability to sell their labor to a capitalist isn't a necessary. And if we can't achieve that, we can at least make it so one's ability to sell their labor to a capitalist isn't a necessary prerequisite.